will be good. Can you see that on the share screen?
Yes, sir.
All right, good. Well, not being able to see my face is no big loss. But yeah, I will probably have to have that checked on in between this time and next.
You see you fine.
Oh, well, thank you. The people in class don't have any out. They have to look at me.
But you're off to the side, you're not seeing her.
That would be appropriate. Okay. Let's begin with a word of prayer and then we will dive right in because we have miles to go before we sleep. Our Father, we give you thanks for the power and the wisdom of your word. In the Bible, your word is described as the sword of the mouth of Jesus, and we pray, Father, that you will wield that sword with power and conviction in our lives. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. By the way, I'm supposed to have a mic in my hands, which is across the room, so I'm going to jump up and I will be right back. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Okay, microphone in hand. We're going to be starting tonight somewhere in Judges chapter 6. But I wanted to add a note to the story about Deborah and Barak that we did last time. I hate to come up with something good and then forget to say it, and you wouldn't have the benefit of my pearls of wisdom. That would really irritate me. So, one thing I forgot to mention is we talked about the great victory that God won through Deborah and Barak against Sisera, the general of King Jabin's army, was the meaning of their names. Deborah, interestingly enough, means honeybee, which is a bit of an odd name. Barak means lightning. So you have lightning and honeybee. And after the great victory, they spent the entire chapter 5 of Judges talking, or rather singing a song of a victory song of worship to Yahweh and celebrating the victory. I wish that they had had me as their merchandise manager, because I would have come out with t-shirts that said sizzle and sting, honeybee and lightning. I'm sure I could have done a good business with those. All right, moving now to the story of Gideon that we started last time. Chapter 6 and verse 1, just by way of review, says the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Big surprise. That's the start of every cycle in the book of Judges. And so this time the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And he goes on to say that this particular oppression was worse than any oppression that went before, because the Midianites and those who came with them were as numerous as locusts. And like the locusts, when they came up, they didn't just demand tribute, but they would literally steal and confiscate anything that could be used for food. They would strip the crops bare, they would steal the animals, and they would leave the people with literally nothing. And so verse 4 says they would encamp against them and devour the produce of the land as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, and no sheep or ox or donkey. For they would come up with their livestock in their tents. They would come up like locusts in number. Both they and their camels could not be counted. So they laid waste the land as they came in. And Israel was brought very low because of Midian. And the people of Israel cried out for help to the Lord. We mentioned last time that instead of helping them, verses 8 and 9 and 10, this time the Lord sends a prophet who says, you don't deserve to be helped. We've played this game before. You have forfeited your right to be helped because you continue to turn away from me and to worship idols. In spite of that, God helps them anyway. You ever done this with your kids? You don't deserve such and such, and then you give in. Happens, right? So we went through the first part of this story where the angel of the Lord comes and encounters a young man from the tribe of Benjamin named Gideon. Remember, his name means breaker or hacker, like one who hacks or cuts a stick with an axe. He is threshing wheat in a wine press, which is like in a cave in a low area, because he's trying to hide his wheat from, of course, the Midianites. And the Lord calls him a mighty warrior, in spite of the fact that he's hiding for his life and his goods, and tells him that he is the one who has been chosen as God's judge, as God's deliverer, to rescue the people. Gideon is, like Moses was when he was called, very, very full of objection, very unhappy. And so God gives him a sign, and that sign took the form of an offering that Gideon had brought and placed on a rock. The angel touches the tip of the staff in his hand, and fire springs up from the rock. This is verse 21, and consumes the meat and the unleavened cakes. And then the angel vanishes up in the smoke, as it were. Verse 22 says, then Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. Very good, Gideon. Nothing gets by you. And of course, he thought he would die, because was the Israelite understanding of what happened to people who looked upon the face of God. But the Lord says to him, peace, shalom, do not fear, you will not die. And so Gideon builds an altar, and he calls it the Lord is peace, literally Yahweh Shalom. To this day, it still stands at Ophrah. At the time of the writing of this story, that altar was still visible, still historically present. Then that night, the Lord told him, take your father's bull and the second bull and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has. Gideon's own family, you see, was involved in Baal worship, along with probably all of their neighbors. And so God is first cleaning house. And he has Gideon, who does this at night because he's afraid, pull down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah pole. That would be the pole symbolizing the female deity who was Baal's consort or wife. And so they do that. And the next morning, the men of the town are furious, and they say, who has done this? After investigating, they discover that it was Gideon who did this. And they said, Gideon must die. But Joash, Gideon's father, saves him. He apparently was a man of considerable standing. And he says, can Baal not contend for himself? Does he need you to rescue him or defend his honor? Let Baal deal with him. And so by a clever rhetorical ploy, he saves his son from being murdered. Ironically, as we pointed out last time, in Deuteronomy 13, it was those who stopped worshiping Yahweh and who worshiped Baal that were to be gathered in the middle of the city square and put to death and burned as a literal human sacrifice to God. And yet they're the ones demanding that the Yahweh worshiper be killed. Strange business. Okay. So we come to verse 33, which is where we're really beginning tonight's lesson. Now all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together. Here they come again for their latest raid, and they crossed the Jordan River and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet him. So basically about 4 or 5 tribes are contacted, and there's a mobilization of their men of war. And they gather these up. Verse 36, then Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. By the way, you're going to see this over and over and over, the phrase, as you have said, or as you promised. In spite of the fact that Gideon keeps referring to God's promise, Gideon is still struggling to believe him. The battle in Scripture so often is not so much the physical conflict as it is the battle in the heart of God's servant to come to faith. If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. The fleece would be the the wool that had been sheared off one of the sheep. He said, if there is dew, meaning in the morning, if there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. Verse 38, and it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. The ground was dry, the fleece was soaked, just as he had requested. Then Gideon said to God, let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. This would be the third test, by the way. The first was the sacrifice with the angel, then the one fleece test, and now we're on fleece test number 2. This time he says, let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew. Just in case nature had pulled a bad trick on him the night before. Let's reverse things. This would be the harder case because the fleece would be porous. It would absorb moisture such as dew, whereas the hard ground, the dew would burn off very quickly. So you would expect the fleece to be a little bit damp and the ground maybe to be dry. But this time he wants it reversed. So verse 40, and God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. So Gideon is struggling, and you can't really blame him because, after all, he was going to be facing an army, we learn later, of 135,000 people. For those of you in Lubbock, that's Jones Stadium filled twice. In the ancient world, that could be a very large percentage of an entire nation. There were fewer people back then. An enormous group of people. The Israelites could not possibly muster an army on short notice to contend with, on equal footing militarily with a group like this. So Gideon wants to be really, really sure, and I don't blame him. Chapter 7 and verse 1. Then Gideon, or Jerubbaal, interesting, he switches names here. Jerubbaal means let Baal contend, or let Baal take care of it. This is the name that was given to Gideon because of the incident where he pulled down the altar of Baal. And his father had said, let Baal deal with it. Jerubbaal. And all the people who were with him rose early in the morning, and they encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. So here they are camped not far from the outskirts of the enemy camp. By the way, the name of the spring is called Harod. That word means trembling. Gideon's a scaredy cat, and he comes with his troops to the spring of trembling, and that's where they are. That's a vivid picture. I don't know if the spring got named after their arrival or before, but nonetheless, it's the spring of trembling. Verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. I can see Gideon just scratching his head and going, what? We don't have 1% hardly of the army facing us, and you're telling me we have too many? God says, verse 3, now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. Oh, great. He just lost 70% of his troops. By the way, in Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 8, this is exactly what God said Israel was to do when they went to war. Before Israel went to war, when the troops were mobilized, the priest would approach them and say, is anybody here afraid? If you're afraid, leave. That was literally what they did. Can you imagine drafting an entire army and then saying, by the way, if you're scared, get out of here? God said that's the way you conduct battle. Well, that trimmed him from 32,000 down to 10,000. Verse 4, and the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. I could see Gideon thinking, wow, still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall not go, shall not go. So Gideon brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. The Hebrew here is very difficult. It's a very ancient language, and it is not entirely clear from the Hebrew exactly what the difference was between the two methods of drinking. But in the end, it doesn't matter, because all it was an arbitrary test. All God is doing is thinning the herd. Didn't matter how. And so he uses this simple differentiation between the methods by which the soldiers drink to take another 9,700 troops out of the equation, leaving Gideon with 300. Facing an army of 135,000, this should be good. Verse 8. So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men. And the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. And I really feel sorry for Gideon at this point. This is a suicide mission. And yet, to his credit, even though he's trembling at the spring of trembling, he is still obeying God. That I respect. Now, Gideon's already had 3 tests to discern that this was truly God's command and God's will, and he was appointed. Now the Lord gives him one more, just free gratis, doesn't even charge. Verse 9, that same night the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand. Notice how he speaks in the past tense. It's already done. 135,000, no problem. But if you are afraid to go down, go down. Excuse me? Go down to the camp, because I've given it to you. But if you're afraid to go down with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say. And afterward, your hands will be strengthened to go down. So if you're afraid to go down anyway, not to fight, just to sneak around and listen. And then you will be a changed man. So he goes down with his servant to the outposts of the armed men who were in the Midianite camp. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. And when Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade. And he said, behold, I dreamed a dream. And in my dream, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned it upside down, so that the tent lay flat. And his comrade answered, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. Can you imagine sneaking up to the guards on the outskirts of your enemy camp and hearing them speak of your name? What are the odds? Of course, it's ridiculous. There are no odds that it could account for this. And so finally, God said to Gideon, I've given you the whole camp. And then he hears the Midianite soldiers say, God has given all of us into his hand. Finally, Gideon believes. So verse 15, as soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped. Time to have a little church service there on the edge of the enemy camp. And then he returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given, there we are again, the host of Midian into your hand. So God started this little episode saying, I have given them into your hand. But if you don't believe me, go down and listen to them. And they say, God has given us into Gideon's hand. Now Gideon goes back to his troops and tells them, God has given them into our hand. 3 times this is repeated. So he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets into the hands of all of them and empty jars and with torches inside the jars. Does anybody remember me saying that we were going to come across a lot of weird weapons in the book of Judges, from this little two-edged dagger that Ehud fashioned to stab the fat king, to the tent peg that Jael drove through the temple of the enemy general. There's one I'm missing, but anyway. Now Gideon is sending into war with trumpets. Let's go raid the band room and then we'll go to battle. And oh yeah, bring your pottery jars. That's right. We're gonna scare them with shards of pottery. That's what we're gonna do. And torches, don't forget. And these are not electric torch, we call them flashlights. The English call them torches. These were the old-fashioned kind, meaning you had a stick with some kind of cloth wrapped around it and dipped in tar or pitch, and then they would light it. And so they had these torches lit with fire, but they were inside the jars, so they could not be seen in the dark. Verse 17, and he said to them, look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of all the camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. So he's got 300 men, right? They're about to surround a city. Lubbock is a little bit over 200,000 now. Abilene, I'm guessing, would be 135,000, give or take. I don't know for sure, but think about that. He's got 300 men. He could have divided them into 3 groups and surround the whole camp. Wouldn't be as big as Abilene, but it would be big. So the 3 companies, oh, wait a minute. The Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, kind of the middle of the night, when they had just set the watch. And they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. That would mean that now the torches are visible. Then, verse 20, the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, a sword for the Lord, literally Yahweh, and for Gideon. All right, picture this. They're divided into 3 companies on 3 way scattered different points around the entire camp of the enemy. At Gideon's command, they blow the trumpets, which they're holding in one hand, and they smash the pottery jars and hold up the torch that they're holding with the other hand. And they shout, a sword. But how many of them were holding swords? You got a trumpet in one hand, you got a torch in the other. Where's your sword? It's not in your hand. They went to battle, and not a single man had a sword in his hand. They had a sword in their mouth. They shouted, a sword. When I read this, I thought, leave it to God to do something this weird. But you know what was happening here? In Revelation chapter 19, John says, I looked and behold, I saw a rider on a white horse. And issuing from the mouth of the rider on the white horse was a sword, which is the word of God. And then in the last verse or so of Revelation 19, it says, he slew the enemy with the sword that issues from his mouth. These guys didn't need physical swords in their hands. They won a battle against 135,000 troops with a trumpet and a torch. And then a verbal sword. Go figure. They do not teach this at West Point, folks. Every man, verse 21, stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth-shittah towards Zererah, and as far as the border of Abel-Meholah by Tabath. Where are these places? I don't have a clue, but if you had lived over back then, you would know. So verse 23, and the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher and all Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. So now that the 300 have won the battle by standing in place and blowing trumpets, Gideon calls out all the rest of the Israelites to come and help with the slaughter. the ones who were close by. Verse 24, Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them as far as Bethbara and also the Jordan. So the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Bethbara and also the Jordan. Now, the Jordan River cuts Israel basically in half, north to south. The entire country pretty much is divided from the Sea of Galilee in the north, all the way down to the Dead Sea by this river. And these Midianites had all come from the east. They had crossed over the Jordan River to pillage and plunder in Israel. In their running away, they're going to have to go back across the river to escape back to their own land. So the men of Ephraim are called down to hold the fords of the river Jordan and to kill the Midianites as they flee toward them, to stop them there at the edge of the water and slay them there. That was the idea. Verse 25, and they captured the two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. My goodness, I don't know where they get these names. Actually, you know what those names mean? One of them means wolf and the other means raven, curiously. And they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. Let's take a moment to think back. When the angel of the Lord first found Gideon and called him to be the deliverer, where was Gideon? He was in a winepress, wasn't he? And when Gideon brought the offering to test who it was talking to him, it was put on a large rock next to the winepress. So now we come full circle, and the two princes of Midian are killed in a winepress and on a rock. Just a little happenstance in the story. Okay. Now that they have basically waxed the floor with the enemy and they're taking a breather, there's a little squabbling amongst the troops, chapter 8 and verse 1. Then the men of Ephraim said to him, what is this that you have done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against Midian? And they accused him fiercely. By the way, we're going to see Ephraim do this time and again in the book of Judges. How come you didn't let us share the glory of winning the battle? And Gideon said to them, verse 2, what have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? Remember, Gideon was from Manasseh, which was the other tribe of Joseph. And Ephraimites and Manassites were like brothers. They were probably at odds with each other a lot. You know, they were kind of arch enemies just because they were brother tribes. Verse 3, God has given into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger against him subsided when he said this. Basically, Gideon played the diplomat and he said, your victory's bigger than mine. What's your problem? And so he basically pandered to their pride and they settled down. Somebody else in the future will not do so, and the result will be quite different. But the battle is not over. You see, the battle happens in two parts. The Midianites came from the east, and they came west across the Jordan, and they were defeated on the west side of the Jordan. But not all of them were killed crossing back over. A great many of them managed to escape. And so Gideon and his 300 men also crossed the Jordan and pursued after them to finish the job. Verse 4. Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and the 300 men with him, exhausted, yet pursuing. So he said to the men of the town of Succoth, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted. And I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. Already killed the princes, but the kings have escaped. Verse 6. And the officials of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand that we should give bread to your army? You see, the people in Succoth were still afraid of the Midianites. They hadn't had time to catch up with the events that had happened. And so they were doubtful, just like Gideon had been doubtful in the beginning. Why should we help you? We help you, and the Midianites find out about it. They'll descend on us like a falling anvil in a Looney Tunes movie. Verse 7. So Gideon said, well then, when the Lord has given them into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. I'll punish you for not helping me. Verse 8. From there he went up to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way, asking for help, that is. And the men of Penuel answered him the same way that the men of Succoth had answered. And he said to the men of Penuel, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. Suddenly, we see a different Gideon here. He's no longer trembling and afraid. In fact, he's throwing about his weight, and he's saying, if you don't help me, there will be hell to pay. In fact, it's noted by commentators that the name of Yahweh does not even appear in the second battle, the battle on the east side, the Transjordan side, almost as if Gideon has outstripped what God told him to do, and now Gideon is doing what Gideon tells him to do. Verse 10. Now Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian, were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, who were all that was left of the army of the people of the east. For there had fallen 120,000 men who drew the sword, mostly killed by each other. And Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers east of Nobah and Jogbehah and attacked the army, for the army felt secure. Karkor was a city that was about 170 miles away from the original site of the battle. So Gideon was motivated enough with his 300 men to make a 170-mile trek to surprise and to finish off the remainder of the army. No wonder he wanted supplies. He wasn't going in an army bus. They were on foot. Verse 12, and Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and he threw all the army into a panic. Then it says he returned from battle, and in verse 14, he captured a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and he wrote down for him the names of the officials and elders of Succoth, 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth, and he said, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted? And he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth a lesson. He basically whipped them with the branches of thorn trees. That's a bloody business, folks. But what's worse is he probably killed them in the process. One commentator said it was almost a certainty that these men weren't merely wounded. They were probably beaten to death. Verse 17, now he comes to Penuel, the other city that did not offer help. He broke down the tower of Penuel and he killed the men of the city. What's happening here? Here's a young Israelite man who was called by God to be a deliverer. Somewhere in the middle of the battle, the impossible battle, 300 against 135,000, he discovers his courage. But more than his courage, he discovers that he likes being in charge and he likes playing the bully. And this is the first time in the book of Judges that an Israelite turns on his own people and kills them. This time it's not the foreigners only who are destroyed, but here you have an Israelite leader who actually kills his own people in anger and in judgment. Told you the story was going to get dark, and it's going to get a lot darker yet. Any of you who have been alive for more than 3 or 4 decades will recognize the change in our own nation that has come about, because you will notice, based on the latest news reports and what our elites are telling us, that our government is no longer worried about foreign enemies. All the rhetoric is about that. You know who the enemy is? It's our own people. We have multiple government agencies who are arming themselves with sophisticated weapons and unbelievable amounts of ammunition. And why are they doing that? Most of these agencies are not concerned with foreign, they're not the State Department, they're not concerned with the enemy, unless the enemy is us. We're told that white supremacy is the great evil that threatens to destroy thousands and hundreds of thousands of our own people. The army is literally being trained right now to go to war against white straight males in America. You think that's crazy? It's actually happening. In their training, they're being taught that white supremacy is the great threat that they will have to face. Wow. When a nation turns against God, the nation also turns against itself. Isn't it interesting that the leading ideology that the elites, the government, and our media are promoting now says there is absolutely nothing good in America. America is a mistake. America is a shame. And we are encouraged to have new identity in smaller groups that turns us against ourselves. The future of America, we've not seen this since 1860, folks. But the day is fast coming, and in fact is already here, when Americans are going to begin murdering Americans in large numbers. And this is the point that Israel was at, starting with somebody that in our Sunday school lessons is a hero. His name was Gideon. And he shed the blood of his own people because they would not help him. Here's the irony. Gideon himself took how many tests of God to finally have the courage to go tackle Midian? 4 tests, right? God was patient and merciful with Gideon. But when Gideon comes to the people of Penuel and the people of Succoth, he is not at all patient with their fear and their slowness to believe. Instead, he kills them. Chapter 8 and verse 18. Then Gideon said to Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian, "Where are the men whom you killed at Tabor?" They answered, "As you were, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king." And he said, "They were my brothers." Now do you see the reason for the 170-mile march? This is withheld to the very tail end of the story. He says he's interrogating the enemy kings that he's captured. And he says, "You killed some guys at the city of Tabor. Where are those? Or where are they?" And they said, "That's funny. They looked a lot like you." And Gideon said, verse 19, "They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, I would not kill you." So he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Rise and kill them." But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. It's ironic. The Gideon that crossed the Jordan River was just like Jether before he crossed. He was a young man who was afraid. Now he's slowly turning into a monster. But his son is just like what he was a few days back. Verse 21. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and fall on us, for as the man is, so is his strength." So Gideon arose and he killed the 2 kings, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. Things are about to go downhill in a big way for Gideon. You'll notice this part is never told in the Sunday school lessons, because you got to be a hero there. And he was a hero. Pity the story didn't stop earlier. Verse 22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Let's have a kingship. Let's have a dynasty. You're our guy." Well, unless you're from Succoth or Penuel. And Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you," verse 23, "and my son will not rule over you. Yahweh will rule over you." Good answer, Gideon. But you notice the battle cry was a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. The desire for glory is already sneaking into the story. And so even though Gideon makes the right noises, verse 24, we find out that he doesn't really do the right stuff. And Gideon said to them, "Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil," for they had golden earrings because the Midianites were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. If you were an Israelite raised on the Old Testament, your ears would prickle at this particular detail, because you would remember from the story in the book of Exodus that when Moses had been gone up the mountain for too long, they said to Aaron, we don't know where this guy Moses has gone. We need a new God. And Aaron said to them, give me your golden earrings. Nothing good happens with golden earrings in the Bible. Nothing. There's even a proverb that says, like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman without discretion. Nothing good happens with gold rings in the Bible. Hardly. Here again, no deliverer, no judge before this ever asked for a reward from the spoils. Gideon's the first one. And the weight of the gold rings, verse 26, that he requested. By the way, you remember what Aaron did with those gold earrings? He turned it into a golden calf that the people worshiped. And God's wrath and anger came down on them in a big, big way. Going to happen again. The weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold. I forget exactly, but that's, see if there's a note down here. It's like 30 pounds, maybe it's something less than 100 pounds. It was still quite a bit of gold. And besides the pendants, the crescent ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments that were worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it. That's a priestly garment. Only the garment's not one that you wear because they're made of gold. It wasn't made of cloth. It was basically an idol. In fact, the Hebrew here may indicate that there was not only a priestly ephod, but there might have been an actual graven image that it was, like it was put around the shoulders of. So Gideon takes this gold from the offering of earrings, and he made an ephod and put it in his own city, in the city of Ophrah. And all Israel whored after it there. The word means they prostituted themselves after it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Here's the deal. Over in Shiloh, the real tabernacle, the real Holy of Holies, the tent of God is there. The priests are there. God's furniture is there. The ark is there. But now there's an alternative. There's a rival worship site with a golden ephod over in Ophrah, in the city of Gideon. And instead of going to real church, instead of going to Yahweh's temple, they're now all going over to the golden ephod in Ophrah. Told you this wasn't talked about in Sunday school because this is not a hero of faith type story. The very person that God raised up, the very person who used his father's ox to break down the altar of Baal and to hack down the Asherah pole, is now making his own idol. Now, in credit to him, he probably didn't call the idol Baal. He probably said it was simply another place to worship Yahweh. But he was worshiping Yahweh not according to God's instructions, but the way the Canaanites worship their gods, which is why one of the commentators refers to this as the Canaanization of Israel. They're still using Yahweh's name, but they're worshiping after the manner of pagans. Verse 28. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more. And the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives. You see, this is what only a king could do. You had, in this day and time, to support all your women and all your kids. So he said, no, I will not be a king. I will not reign over you, nor my son, because Yahweh is your king. But he lived like a king. He asked for the spoils of war. He was making the right noises, but behind the scenes, he was actually a king. And beside his 70 sons, there's a little note in verse 31. He had a concubine who lived in Shechem, about 17 miles away from Ophrah. And she also bore him a son whose name he called Abimelech. And by the way, here's the real clue to the fact that he really was a king. You know what Abimelech means? My father is the king. He named his own son, my dad is king. All right, Gideon, I think, the secret's out of the closet now. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash, his father, at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. All right, that is a good place for us to break for 5 minutes. Have a drink, go worship at the porcelain altar, do whatever you need to do. And we shall return at about 6:26.
David,
Yes.
this is Rhonda Newbold. I just wanted to say that I was a little late, but I'm here now.
Gotcha. I will be happy to add you to the list.
Thank you.
Do we know where David Langford is tonight?
Rex and Charmaine had a visitation for a family that lost a loved one that is in their life group.
Oh, it's in our life group too.
Yeah,
We did not know it
ours,
was
we
in Brownfield.
didn't know. It's in Brownfield. Services, somewhere. Sea Graves and Seminole War.
They're a ways down.
Yeah.
I lived in Brownfield for 5 years. back
Oh,
in the
you did?
90s.
Good times and Sea Graves. That big cemetery.
It's Seagraves.
Some of those folks can still vote for Democrats.
Probably did last election.
Cousin Waylon Mullins, who lived down near Seagraves Farm down there on my mother's side.
Okay.
He's
There are a lot of
passed
Mullins
since,
on there.
Yeah.
There are a lot of Mullins.
Oh, yeah.
And Shelburne. So.
They kind of like the video that I said much of it. Interestingly, Ed Mullins, I don't think is very closely related.
I don't think so.
I think it's
I
different.
don't think he's in this. He's a good man.
Have you been in North Carolina?
She got here in August and I got here in September of
Okay,
77.
when Elmer did. I grew up in Odessa.
So you're Southerners.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. No, we're in West Texas.
Yes, that's right.
Different from us. Sorry.
That's true, by the way.
And then we, after a few years of marriage, moved here. Raised our kids here. And we're soon leaving. Yes.
Where'd you-
Where our daughter lives in Brock, near Weatherford.
Yep.
She and her husband have 3 little boys. And we knew somewhere along the way we would be called on to come.
It's gonna be quite a change.
We have been, after 45 years, yes. Yes,
Wow.
it is, but it's also a very,
But there's a special blessing. Be close to.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Her husband, well, he worked with the House Ag Committee Chairman a few years ago in these state of these. And she worked there too. So they had kids, they went back to Texas, but he still goes to DC about 2 weeks a month.
Most of the time, but he's got clients in Nebraska and Idaho.
Scattered, yeah.
Well, but they meet in DC when they need
Right.
a bill passed. That's what Scott does. He takes it to the right people for boys are in 3 different schools in 2 different towns. And she said, I need help.
Yeah.
We hear you.
You know, my parents, when they moved away about 8, 9 years ago, this is the first time in my adult life that we lived in the same,
Is that right?
same community.
Oh, wow.
So it's been
How
nice.
about that? You bet. You bet. They're 2 of the people that we most hate to leave.
Yeah, they're sweeties. All right, we're back.
Brother David,
Yes.
quick question. I forgot what you said Zeba and Zalmunna means again.
I did not actually say. Zeba means sacrifice, which he became one. And Zalmunna is a little bit more difficult. Their scholars are not entirely sure. One possible meaning is that it means shelter or protection refused, that somebody is refusing shelter or refusing protection. Or it could mean Salmu has shaken, Salmu being the name of a god, a Midianite god. Salmu has shaken. So yeah, those are different names.
Thank you.
Surely. All right, chapter 8, verse 33. As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. The Baals is kind of a generic term for Canaanite deities, and Baal Berith would be a specific Baal that the people of Shechem, as we will find out, the town of Shechem claimed as their own god. Verse 34, and the people of Israel did not remember Yahweh their God, who had delivered them from the hand of their enemies on every side, and they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. So no sooner is Gideon in the ground than here we go again. Now this is not a separate judge cycle. We're still in Gideon's family, so this is really considered to be a continuation of Gideon's story, but it's going to get real ugly real fast. That brings us to the end of chapter 8 and the beginning of Gideon part 2, chapter 9, verse 1. Now Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem. Now remember, Gideon had 70 sons, right? By his actual wives. And then he has his son by his concubine, which is kind of like a slave wife. Abimelech was the son of the slave wife. He's the son of Gideon. He went to Shechem to his mother's relatives. Remember, he didn't live in Ophrah with the rest of them. He lived over in Shechem, because if you're going to have a slave woman who's not really part of the household, sometimes distance is a good thing. And he said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family, say this in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and flesh. You don't really want 70 sons of Gideon ruling over you, do you? How about just me? Besides, my mama's from here. I'm your kin. And his mother's relatives spoke all these words on his behalf in the ears of the leaders of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. What you have here is the makings of a revolt. Verse 4, and they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal Berith. In other words, from the treasury of the idol temple, they give him 70 pieces of silver, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. The word worthless here is a word that in Hebrew literally means empty. These were mercenaries. People who are godly have something with which to fill their lives. They usually have, for instance, a job, as opposed to being indolent and idle. They have a plan, or they're in school. Something is happening in their lives because they have discipline, they have character, they are plugged into the community. But in every society, there are going to be some people who hang around like dogs in the marketplace, just waiting for something to fill their empty lives. This kind of people, Abimelech took the money that was given to him out of the idol temple, and he hires a bunch of mercenaries, people with no discipline, no character, and no ethics. They're available. Somebody offers them a job. I'll give you money. Cool. They took it. Verse 5. And Abimelech went to his father's house at Ophrah, and he killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. This wild tale, by the word, but notice the mention of numbers in this story. Abimelech says, do you really want 70 guys ruling over you, or just one? The term one is going to be real important in this story. So they agree to the one. They agree to support him, and he goes back to Gideon's city, Ophrah, about 70 miles away. And there he gets a big stone, and this is the way that butchers would operate in this day and time. This would be called an abattoir stone or a slaughterhouse rock. And he takes, basically, his brothers are cattle to him. He takes them one by one and butchers them on a butcher's slab. That's what he does. On one stone. He says, one ruler, now we have one stone, and guess what? One gets away. The youngest boy, I don't know where he was, but he managed to hide himself. Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. Verse 6. And all the leaders of Shechem came together, and all Beth Millo. That's simply a term that basically means the lords of Shechem. It's probably a synonym for the leaders. And they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. Remember, Gideon was king in truth, but he wouldn't take the title. But his son has no such problems. Here is Israel's first, if you will, king in name. And he is a murderer on a grand scale. And they do this by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. The pillar was actually a big rock that was set upright, a big stone that was set upright to represent the god Baal. And the tree next to it was probably considered to be a sacred tree. So this is where they would conduct the ceremony of crowning the king. I'm going to do a stop share here for just a minute and see if I can bring up something that relates to this. Dang it, can't find it on here. The fact that Baal had I'm trying to get my Zoom thing to come back up. Oh, there it is. It got moved over. Okay. Oh, there it is. This is a freebie. Menhir, you ever heard the term menhir that refer to big rocks that are set up all across parts of Europe? Thousands upon thousands of them. The term menhir literally means long stone. And here is a little article from Wikipedia. It says that menhirs, these long stones that are set upright, are widely distributed across Europe, Asia, and Africa, but they are most numerous in Western Europe, particularly in Ireland, Great Britain, and Brittany, which is a little piece of northwestern France. There are 50,000 examples in these areas in Great Britain, Ireland, and Brittany, and in Northwest France, where there are some 1,200 further examples. We don't know who the people are that put up these rocks, and we don't even know what the meaning of these rocks is. But there are these huge rocks that were set upright, and they seem to have something to do possibly with religion, but the people who put them up lived thousands of years ago, and they're everywhere. There are tens of thousands of these across Europe, but we don't know who put them up, and we don't know what they mean. But we do know that the early Christians didn't like them very much because, as the article goes on to say, in North Europe, there used to be about 50,000 of these, and about 40,000 of them were destroyed by Christians. They took them to have, some kind of spiritual significance dealing with the Druids or the religions of the Germanic peoples, and they destroyed large numbers of them, leaving only about 10,000 in that particular area. Curious, huh?
Yeah.
So, menhirs. Baal had his own form of a menhir. They had a Baal rock, big standing rock that was Baal's deal. All right, let me get back to the text here. All right. Those of you who are European have ancestors who might have been the folks who put up all those menhirs. You had your own Baal rocks, folks. Just thought I'd make that personal. So they make Abimelech king. Verse 7, when it was told to Jotham, remember he's the surviving boy, the one that got away. When it was told to Jotham, he went and stood at the top of Mount Gerizim, which is right to the south of Shechem. So he's climbing a mountain right to the south of town so he can look down and talk to them safely. And he cried aloud and said to them, listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you. And he tells them this story. The trees once went out to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive said, shall I leave my abundance by which gods and men are honored and go hold sway over the trees? And so the tree said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go hold sway over the trees? So the tree said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men and go hold sway over the trees? So at last the tree said to the bramble, the thorn bush, you come and reign over us. My goodness. Jotham seems to be indicating that, not to be an insult to teachers, you've heard the phrase, those who can do, those who can't teach. It's kind of insulting to teachers. But Jotham's saying this about politics. Those who can do, they do real jobs. Those who can't go into politics. There might be some truth in that. Anyway. You come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, verse 15, if in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. This is ironic because A, a bramble is a small bush and a tree cannot take refuge in its shade. And B, it doesn't have any shade, it has thorns. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. The bramble basically says, I'm a thorn bush. You have now disturbed me. If your offer is real, then do it in truth. But if you're just putting me on, you're going to get hurt. Then Jotham continues and says to the people of Shechem, now therefore, if you acted in good faith and integrity when you made Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, that is my father, if you have done to him as his deeds deserved, for my father fought for you and risked his life and delivered you from the hand of Midian. And yet you have risen up against my father's house this day and have killed his sons, 70 men on one stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his female slave, king over the leaders of Shechem, because he is your relative. If you then have acted in good faith and integrity with Jerubbaal and his house, then rejoice in Abimelech and let him rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the leaders of Shechem and Beth Millo. And let fire come out from the leaders of Shechem and from Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. If you have played fair and right, then may God bless your arrangement, you scoundrels. But if you are the sons of that I know you are, then may God bring judgment on you. And then Jotham ran away, smart guy, and he fled and went to Beer and lived there. Nobody knows where Beer is. It simply means well. He went to well because of Abimelech, his brother. He was afraid. Wouldn't you be? I bet Abimelech was a fisherman who kept telling the story of the one that got away. So what happened? Verse 22, Abimelech ruled over Israel for 3 years. And God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem. Do you remember in the story of David and Saul, King Saul, that God sent an evil spirit to trouble King Saul, and it could only be soothed when David played his harp? Same deal here. God sends an evil spirit, a bad spirit. In Hebrew, this is literally ruach ra'ah. Ruach ra'ah, a bad spirit, between Abimelech and the people that made him king, so that they distrust each other. They don't like each other anymore. They're not really allies anymore. And the leaders of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech, that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come, and their blood be laid on Abimelech, their brother, who killed them, and on the men of Shechem, who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers. Verse 25, the leaders of Shechem put men in ambush against him on the mountaintops, and they robbed all who passed by them along that way. And it was told to Abimelech. So the people of Shechem now hire their own mercenaries, and they act as bandits. They basically waylay travelers on the roadside, and they plan if Abimelech comes that way, they're going to deal with him too. Verse 26 introduces a new character into the story. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, moved into Shechem with his relatives, and the leaders of Shechem put confidence in him. They haven't got confidence in Abimelech anymore. Now they've got a new guy. And they went out into the field and gathered the grapes from their vineyards and trod them and held a festival. And they went into the house of their God, and they ate and drank, and they cursed or reviled Abimelech. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, said, who is Abimelech? And who are we of Shechem that we should serve him? Is he not the son of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon? And is not Zebul his officer? Zebul was the governor serving Abimelech that was still in the city of Shechem. It was still officially under Abimelech's control. Instead, Gaal says, serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem. Why should we serve him? Why should we serve Abimelech? Gaal is doing the same thing Abimelech did. Abimelech came and he said, you don't need 70 sons to rule over you. My mama's from here. You should have one leader, and it should be your own kin. Gaal claims to be from Shechem, but not just from Shechem, but he claims to be from the Canaanites in Shechem. Hamor was the founder of Shechem several hundred years before this. Remember when Jacob, the son of Isaac, was coming back home to his papa's house? On the way, he and his 12 sons and his 4 wives wind up in Shechem, which was a new city back then. And he dealt with Hamor, the father of the city, whose son violated, raped Dinah in the story from Genesis 37, thereabouts. Gaal basically claims to be from that lineage. So Shechem was not just an Israelite city, but we have the same problem the whole book of Judges has had. You got Canaanites still living among them. And Abimelech had said, serve me because my mama's from here. You know, I'm kin. Gaal says, well, I'm even more kin than he is. You do it in one better. He continues in verse 29, would that this people were under my hand, then I would remove Abimelech. And I would say to Abimelech, increase your army and come out. Big words, big boasts, the kind people make when they've had a little too much wine. Verse 30, when Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal, the son of Ebed, his anger was kindled. So he sends messengers to Abimelech saying, the son of Ebed, Gaal, the son of Ebed, and his relatives have come up, and they are stirring up the city against you. Now, therefore, go by night, you and the people who are with you, and set an ambush in the field. I'm going to have to kind of summarize a bit of this because we need to get to the end of this story by not too long from now. Zebul says, this Gale guy is stirring up the city against you, so you need to come and set an ambush and deal with him. So Abimelech came with his mercenaries, and he divided them into 4 companies. He set them against the city, and the next morning, when the people began to go out of the city to go to the fields to work, or started that process, Abimelech and his army swooped down upon them and began to kill them and drove them back into the city. And Gale, who was the one stirring up the rebellion against Abimelech, most of his followers were killed, and he himself was then driven out of the city by Zebul, the governor who was working for Abimelech. Then Abimelech goes away. He doesn't enter the city. He just basically kills people up to the entrance, disciplines them, kills a bunch, and then leaves. And Zebul, his governor, is still in charge of the city. But Abimelech apparently wasn't through. He was still angry. So the following day, the people go back out to the field and Abimelech is told. So he brings his army back out and he proceeds to fall on the unsuspecting men and women and children who are working in the field, and he puts them all to death. He puts them all to the sword. He basically kills the entire lower caste of the town, all the little people. And then he enters the city. And the lords, the leaders of the city, have a strong tower in the middle of the city. And when they see Abimelech coming, they run to the tower and enter the tower, which is part of the temple of this god, Baal of El Berith. Abimelech was told they're sheltered in the tower. So Abimelech takes his men, goes to a nearby mountain, and they cut down and gather bundles of wood and branches, and they bring it back down. They lay their wood around the tower where the lords of Shechem have taken refuge and set the tower on fire. And they have them a human barbecue. And in that tower, it says 1,000 men and women were burned alive. Then Abimelech moves on to a nearby city called Thebez, and he captures it. He kills the ones he can reach, but this city also had a strong tower in it. And so the men and the women and the leaders of the city fled to the tower, and they shut themselves in, and they went up to the roof of the tower where they could look over. But Abimelech has experience with towers now. He knows what to do, right? So back to the mountain, they go get their wood, and they bring it in order to prepare to burn this tower and to destroy its people. Verse 52. And Abimelech came to the tower, and he fought against it, and he drew near to the door of the tower to burn it with fire. And one woman, is what the Hebrew literally says, a certain woman, one woman, threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. He has to be close to the wall of the tower because he's stacking his wood around the base. And way up at the top of the tower, a woman is leaning over, and she pulls this millstone. A mill was composed of 2 big stones, a bottom stone that was really big, and you would put your grain on it, and then the top stone would be used to grind or crush it on top. And the top stone didn't necessarily have to be very big. Some of them were like 9 to 15 pounds, or they could have been somewhat larger. But from a height, a 9 to 15 pound stone can do all that you need it to do. She threw this stone down. It landed smack on Abimelech's head. I've done this in Israel. When I was 10 years old, I was on top of the YMCA hotel there, which was quite a few stories high. We were on top, my brother and I littered. I confess it. I sinned. Bless me, Father. I was eating an apple. Got through eating it. We wanted to see what would happen to an apple core if we dropped it from that height. So we went over to a side where there was an alley, and we dropped our apple core. Yeah, we did that. Nobody was in the alley. I didn't kill anybody. So Abimelech calls quickly, verse 54, to the young man, his armor bearer, and he said, draw your sword and kill me, lest they say of me, a woman killed him. And his young man thrust him through, and he died. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, everyone left or departed to his home. Here's the irony. Abimelech's story starts with a woman, the slave concubine, that was his mother. That's why he was only a stepbrother, and that's why he didn't like his brothers so much. His mother was a concubine, a wife of Gideon. The story starts with his mother who gave him birth, and his story ends with a woman who drops a rock on his head and kills him, which was ironic because didn't we read that in the beginning of the story, he killed his 69 brothers on one stone? Well, poetic justice. One stone fell on him and did him in. Thus, God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father in killing his brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return on their heads. And upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. So in this terrible story, there is no foreign oppressor. There is no Midianite or Moabite or Ammonite or Philistine. The oppressors are Israelites. They're destroying their own people. And God has to drop a falling anvil. He gets the Looney Tunes treatment to kill the first king of Israel, who was one of the worst men who was ever born. This is the judgment of God on a nation that forgets him. Terribly sad, terribly bloody. But that's Judges. All right, folks, we are 3 minutes over time. I gave you 2 minutes. I quit early last time, so sorry. I've done abused you this time. We will stop there. And we will pick up next time, next Tuesday. Y'all have a blessed evening. Bye for now.
It's interesting.
Thank you for
Bye.
making it so
Thank you.
interesting, David.
Thank you.